All right, I have threaded my needle, not at the end. Now we're gonna work from this line over. We're gonna use this as our guideline. Now, you could use your card again and draw some extra lines in here to help you see where we're gonna go. But we're gonna use this line as our first starting place. So coming up on either the top or the bottom, whatever feels best, we're gonna come up just below the line. And then we're gonna follow this line all the way across. Now, since there is a line right here next to it, we don't need to pull our string. But if you're ever confused about where you need to go next, you can pull your thread, lay it down where it needs to go, and then just scoot it out of the way just a little bit to get your needle where it's supposed to go. So come up on this side and we're gonna go down right here on the line just to the side of our guide. Now we're gonna do 2 stitches right next to each other for this basket weave. So I'm gonna come up on this side again, and I'm gonna, well, that's a little bit hard next to this top of my hoop, test and see, and that's actually really close, so I might scoot down just a little bit farther along my line, I should say, so that this next stitch lays next to our thread instead of moving it like it was before. So this thread lays right next to the first one, all the way down. And see, now that almost looks like it's too far apart. I think it's gonna be okay. To right next to our first stitch. So this is going to be one stripe, if you will. Then we're gonna make a gap that is the same width as our 2 stitches together, and then we're gonna make 2 new long stitches, and then a gap, and then long stitches, and then a gap. So this is where drawing a line could be helpful if you struggle to visualize what this space was. If I were to draw a line, what I would do is, now that I can see what this space looks like, how wide that is, what my 2 stitches look like, I'd line this up, say that open space looks pretty close to the same size as my 2 stitches. Maybe I was off just a little bit. And then I will draw a line here, and then that would be my new guideline. Usually I do it without drawing a new line, but I know it can be difficult to visualize sometimes. So we're gonna come up on the same side that we were on, and then you can check and make sure you like where it is. Go down. And then again, we're gonna come up next to our first stitch on the line here. And go back across. And we're just going to keep repeating this process all the way across our entire hat. So this time without a guide, I can see this space here, and I can try and mimic that same length right here. So I know I'm coming up close to where I want to be, and then I can test with my needle, see where that's going to lay. If it feels too close or too far away, you can adjust. Come up and then see where it needs to lay down. Now at any point, if any of these starts to feel off for you, any of these stitches, take a minute, pull them back out, and try again. They're really big stitches, so it's going to be easy to pull them out and start again. Also, a lot of the imperfections that you might be seeing now as you're making these foundation stitches will disappear as soon as we weave in the cross lines. All right, so don't stress too much about it. Just try and be consistent with whatever you got going on. So I'm going to keep going, and then we'll meet up when we go back the other direction. All right, I've finished all of my stripes for one direction, and I wanted to point out two things. One, when I got to this spot right here on the other area, there was enough space for one of these threads, but not both. So you might run into that. And you can see that this isn't perfect. Some of these are closer together. Some of them have a little bit of gap. Some of these are farther apart. So just don't stress too much about it. Do the best that you can, and then we'll go from there. Now, just like how we use this edge as our guide to go this way, we're going to flip and go perpendicular now, which happens to be this line and this line and this little line here. So I'm going to use the biggest of the three, this line, for my first stitch to help me see where to go. Now we get to go under and over to weave this together. So I'm going to imagine that I'm going under first by coming up under these stitches right here close to the edge. Actually, I think I can get a little bit closer. So that my under is going to be right here on the edge, you know, pretending that it comes from over on the side. So I went under this one, right? And I'm going to go over, under, over, under, over, under. Each 2 sets of stitches. So under, over, now I have to go under again. So I'm going to slide my needle under 2 stitches, and then usually I just do 1 pair at a time and then pull through. You can get your needle under more than 1 at a time, and if that works for you, go with that. If you find that you're catching your needle point on the threads as you do that, you can always flip your needle over and go under with the eye of the needle, because it won't get caught on anything. So under, over, under, over. Here where the strands are a little bit looser, where it hasn't been woven in as much, I can get my needle under 2. I'm gonna make sure nothing's getting twisted. Now we're gonna go under 1 more set, it looks like. Making sure this stays all the way over there so that I get a nice line to work with here. So it looks like I'm aiming for right about the end of this stitch here. So I'm gonna go under, pull this nice and snug, and then I'm going to go down right here where I had land. Now, we worked in pairs this way, so we're going to work in pairs this way. So now I'm going to come back up along the edge next to where my down stitch is. You can see I'm testing with my needle to make sure it's going to be in a good spot. And this one I'm going to match where these stitches are. So this one went under, I'm going to go under. This one went under, going to go under. Under. With this thread there to guide where I'm going, it's a little easier to get my needle under this time. And then I'm going to slide my needle under and into the fabric, because I don't need to get, I could probably get a teensy bit of the edge there, but it's not super important because I know it's not going to be seen. Now, you could work this way or this way. I'm going to work this way because I know I have enough thread to finish this area and then start going back down. So I'm going to jump here. Now you think about it, we're making a basket weave. So our next row will be the opposite, right? See how this row here goes over, under, over. Our next row, if we were working this way, would go under, over, under. So we're going to work this way. So right here, I know I need to go over this one, which means I'm going under this one. And what we're aiming for is having these little white or fabric color boxes still visible when we're done with the weave, because we're going to put a French knot in each of those little boxes. So we want to leave a little bit of space. So I'm going to come up like I went under this one, test my alignment. I'm going to go over, under, over, under, and then I'm going to see where I need to be going down in the fabric, like so. And then we go back. Again, matching our first strand so that, so that we have two strands making a pair, just like we did for the first direction. All right, I just finished right here, and my thread is right here on the back, and I could just jump down here and continue with this next stitch, but occasionally this stitch in person I can see a faint pink line here where I've pulled that behind, and I don't particularly like that. You probably can't see it too much, but instead I'm going to pull my thread this way so that it stays along this line of stitching and I can't see it. Now I can see from where all of these needle points ended up that I'm just going to need the ends of my next stitch will end up right here next to these ones. So I'm going to come up right next to it, just like I can see those stitches did, and then follow the pattern. So I need to go over that one. So I'm going to go under my first, under, over, and just keep weaving until I end up down here. One thing that helps me when I'm weaving is to put my finger on the back side and push up. You can see that it makes the threads tighter, and what it's doing is it's helping me push my finger against that, but then get up over the next one. And then I let go and I push down to get under, finger up to get over. Okay, now I think about where this is gonna meet over here, and I'm thinking it's actually gonna end up right there, sort of like these ones over here. So I'm gonna go under, and let's pull it through just to check and make sure first. Yeah, that feels good. So we're gonna go right here next to that stitch. And we repeat. All right, I have finished my full weave. You can see that most of the holes are the same-ish size. I kind of have a couple big ones up here, so I might have to make some bigger knots to fill in the holes. One thing to think about while you do this is to try not to pull too hard. You do have to kind of tug to get the threads to lay straight, but if you pull too tight, you're going to be pulling your fabric in and it'll start to bunch. So just don't pull too tight as you weave. All right. So we have 6 strands of 3/832 on our needle, and we're ready to make French knots. Now, I did this once before, having only wrapped the thread around the needle one time. And how I stitched it today, I feel like my bigger squares, that is just not filling it in enough. So I'm going to use 2 wraps for my knots today, but you should test out a couple and see. Test out different sizes and see what fills the space best, and then stick with that. You can see they've got holes here. I did 4 or 5 here, and I could definitely tell that my bigger knots were working better. So I've unpicked and I'm starting again. So this is how I make a French knot. You make a circle with the thread. It goes from my left hand around to the needle in my right hand. We're going to wrap 2 times around. Then the thread goes back, sorry, not the thread, the needle goes back into the fabric. You pull the thread down until it nests right next to the fabric. All this hand is doing is just keeping the thread out of the way. And then I'm going to pull straight down and through to make a French knot. And then I'm going to repeat. And again, we make a circle from my left hand all the way around to my right hand, wrapping 1, 2 times around the needle. Needle goes back in the fabric, slide the knot down, pull the thread through. Now, something that's going to happen as you make French knots is your thread is going to get twisted on itself. And if the thread gets too twisted, it's significantly harder to work with. So what you're going to do is every few stitches, you're just going to hold your hoop in one hand and let your thread hang down off the backside and just let it untwist like an old school phone cord. And this will make making your knots significantly easier. Now you can move around your hat however you want. Just want to think about going short distances to your next space for a French knot. We don't want to be jumping all the way back and forth around, but if you get just nice little spaces in between, that's going to save the most thread and even be just the fastest for you as you keep going. So again, knot size is up to you. 1 or 2 wraps should work out great depending on how you have stitched your, sorry, I got my thread caught just a teeny bit on the top here. I don't want to have to redo my French knot because then I have to cut things out. Woo! Pull it down. Rescued it. What was I talking about? 1 or 2 wraps. Depending on how you've stitched the weave, this is going to vary person to person. So don't feel set in stone with whatever you pick first. If it's feeling too big or too little, adjust. I've made sure to give you enough floss in your kit that you can cut out a few and start again as needed. So I'm just going to keep going around, back and forth, traveling short distances from one knot to the next. And we'll check in if I think of anything else important. All right, people, while I was stitching the nose, I remembered something that I was supposed to tell you about the hat that I forgot. So as you stitch the French knots, it's very normal for the knots to get pulled down and get covered a little bit by the thread. The stripes that are next to it. It's just the nature of pulling a French knot tight. So what you do to fix that is you can put your finger behind and kind of just pop them up. And if that doesn't work, you can always just use the tip of your needle and just pull up just a teeny bit. You don't want to distort the knot, but then you can pop it up above the stitching. And you want to do this at the end after you've done messing with it, because as you continue stitching around it, the knots will get pulled back under. I've finished all of my hat, and now we're going to work on the nose and then hands. So for the nose, if you're a quilter, we're gonna make what I'm gonna call a log cabin inspired nose. So you can see we've got a center space and then we've got lines that go around it. Unlike a quilted block, we're not gonna start in the center. We're gonna start on the side and work in. So any side will do. I'm gonna do this tall left side. And now I've got all 6 strands of 4, 5, 3 on my needle. And I'm going to try and get all the way up here into the corner so that there's no gap between my needle and the pink as I stitch. And I'm going to make 1 straight stitch right along the edge of my square. So I'm just following the line. Then I'm going to come up again right next to this stitch and make a new stitch that lays right next to it. So we're making a pair of stitches right next to each other. And then I'm going to go down next to it. All right, there's side 1. Now we're going to do 2. And I'm going to choose to come up. Sorry, finger in the way. Maybe thumb's a little bit better. There we go. I don't want to catch this knot, so I'm going to make sure that it's out of the way. There we go. Come up in the corner here. And then I'm following this top line, but instead of going all the way into the corner, I'm just going to go down right next to, perhaps slightly under this first stitch. Then we repeat because we're making sets of 2 stitches. So I'm going to come up next to it. And then down. Since this stitch isn't on the edge and there's free space under here, I'm going to slide my tip of my needle just barely under those stitches so that we don't get a gap. But I can still see the end of this line finish nicely. Then side 3. So this time I'm going to come up on the corner here. And again, go down straight here. And then the stitch that goes next to it. Again, sliding my needle just barely under. All right. Then we do, I want to make sure these nose threads are going under the hat threads. Now we're going to do the last set. Now we will repeat this process, making a set of 2 new stitches that fill in this space, and then here, here, and here. And we'll just keep going around until there's about a square left in the middle, square space, however big you're comfortable with, and we'll put a couple stitches there in the middle. Okay, here we are at the very center. And I'm going to trade and have my last stitches match this longest side line. Because if I have them match this shortest line like I'm doing now, this line is going to kind of merge into the middle, and I want it to feel like a square in the middle. So it's not super important which direction you choose, but just pause and take a second and think, what way feels the best to me to get these last couple center stitches. And depending on how square you've stitched and how square you traced, you might need more than 2 stitches. You might need 3 stitches in the middle, but just make sure you cover up the whole space so there's not a dead spot in the middle of the nose. Perfect. Now, we're going to stitch the hands. because they are the same color of floss, but I'm going to go from 6 strands to only 3 strands before I forget. I want to show you real quick the back of this one. Just note that there's going to be a decent amount of thread buildup on the back of this nose spot because you're repeating in the same space a lot. So if it starts to feel really chunky on the back, don't worry, you didn't do it wrong. Just anchor off, and then we're going to split our threads so that we can do the hands. Alrighty, I've got 3 strands of 453 on my needle, and now we're going to do satin stitch for both of the square hands. Now the first thing I want you to do is look and make sure that these lines still feel mostly like a square. After you've stitched around them and as your fabric sits in the hoop for a while, sometimes the lines are going to distort a little bit. And when we do satin stitch specifically, we really want to make sure that our lines still feel square, because if we stitch on uneven lines, we're not going to end up with a nice square shape. I'm feeling pretty good about mine. It feels like this line goes down just a little bit, but I'm going to be stitching horizontally across, so I'm not super worried about that. I'm going to start over here on this left-hand side. Yeah, this left-hand side. And let's learn how to do satin stitch. Satin stitch is basically a bunch of straight stitches all smooshed next to each other. So I'm going to come up on this edge. And now you want to always come up into empty fabric if you can. We could come up over here, but then there's a chance of us getting caught on all of these stitches. So we want to come up over here because it's much easier to go down into existing stitches and not get caught on anything. So come up on the line, and then I'm going to go down under into these stitches here. Now you can see even right away with this first stitch, if I pull too hard, our line is no longer straight. So you want to make sure that you're pulling just enough for your stitches to sit flat on the fabric. You don't want to be pulling so tight that you distort the line. Then we're going to do stitch number 2. So we're going to come up right next to our first one, again right on the line, and then go down on the other edge. And we want to make sure that those stitches are nice and close together. Now the most important part with satin stitch is just being very careful about where your needle points are and how hard you pull the thread, because we don't want to have too tight tension here. So I keep saying in my head that I'm coming up on the line, and I might not be able to tell very much through the camera, but in person it feels like on the line might not be the right spot because it's distorting just a little bit as I pull these stitches in. But I know that if I keep stitching right on the line, not inside the line and not outside the line, but right on the line for all of my stitches, because I made my line straight to begin with, this shape will end being straight. So we just keep adding stitches one at a time. Never be afraid to unpick a stitch, pull it out if it's not working for you, and try again. I know nobody wants to have to unpick things, but sometimes pulling out a stitch or two and redoing it makes all the difference in the world. And I just keep going until I get all the way to the bottom of this little hand square. And I want these hands to feel more square than a rectangle. So I'm going to probably finish right here with this stitch and not do another stitch down here to cover this line, because I know my lines erase because I used an erasable pen. So I'm going to stop right here while this section feels square. I'm going to tie off, come over here, and repeat the process filling in this hand. And we're back. Yeah. I finished the hand, and now I've rotated you because this was hiding underneath my clamp here. So we're going to stitch this square using satin stitch in 2 different directions. So for this part, this triangle, our stitches are going to go this way. They're going to point towards this center line. And then for this half of the square, this triangle, the stitches are going to point this way. So we're going to do this outer half first. And something I like to do when I'm going to fill a shape like this, first you could draw guidelines if you wanted to. I don't think they're necessary. It's a small shape. What we're going to do instead is we're going to come up, try and hit as middle as possible. And we're going to go to the point here, and then we'll work to one side, and then we'll come back and work the other direction. This is a great trick for satin stitch on larger shapes or shapes that are irregular. Our little rectangle or square hands we did before are just straight easy shapes. Basically everything but a square about that size, I satin stitch this way. I start in the middle, and then I work my way out, and then I come back. So that middle stitch becomes a guideline stitch, helping me keep my stitches angled the way I want them to be, as opposed to feeling like I have to guess and make the perfect angle with a teeny tiny little stitch on the side. So I'm trying to keep these stitches all nice and parallel, and I'm going to go all the way to the corner here, even though it's a teeny tiny little stitch by the end. Okay, that probably about covers it. So now I'm going to come back and I'm going to fill in this other half. Again, coming up in open fabric. For this shape, I find it easiest to come up on this center line as opposed to the edge lines, because it's easier for me to see that I've lined my needle up in a good position when all of these stitches are lined up together. Knowing that you've come up in a good spot as the stitches are on an angled line is a little bit harder. Also, just like with our hands, we want to make sure before you stitch this shape that you check and make sure that things still feel square or triangular, and adjust any lines that you need to before you stitch, because satin stitch will show if your lines are not how you want them to be. This is also a great time to remind you that this is your embroidery. And if it turns out that your lines are a little bit wonky, or that you have a square here instead of 2 triangles, that is 100% fine. You get to decide what your end embroidery looks like. That's the best part of stitching. You are in control. I'm just here to give you suggestions for how I do it and how to hopefully be as successful as possible. All right, now I'm going to stitch the other direction, and I'm going to go center line to the point. Again, because this teeny tiny little point stitch, if I start on a teeny tiny little point stitch, it's going to be a lot harder to determine sizing and spacing. So I'm just going to go point to point. And this stitch will sit a little bit on top and then slide down off a little bit, which is what we want it to do. So there will be no gap in between our 2 sets of stitches here. And so I'll just continue following this angle and fill in the rest of the strip.